Colonel Hartford felt every eye in the auction yard burning into him as he claimed the savage white stallion no one else would touch for a mere $5. The same horse that had nearly killed 3 men now stood before him, teeth bared and eyes blazing with fury, unaware that this broken old soldier would soon transform his life forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The auction yard fell silent as the white stallion was led into the ring. Even the auctioneer, a man who had seen thousands of horses pass through these gates, hesitated before speaking. The horse's coat, though caked with mud and neglect, couldn't hide the powerful muscles beneath. His eyes burned with a fierce wildness that made the handlers keep their distance, leading him with extra-long ropes attached to the bit that cut into his mouth. The stallion tossed his head and pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring as if daring anyone to come closer. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer finally announced, his voice lacking its usual enthusiasm, "we have here a 5-year-old stallion. No papers, no name. Previous owner claims he's broken to ride, but as you can see..." He trailed off as the horse reared suddenly, nearly pulling the rope from the handler's grasp. Several potential buyers stepped back from the fence. "Shall we start the bidding at $100? The silence that followed was deafening. Not a hand raised, not a voice called out. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. $50 then? Surely this fine animal is worth 50. Again silence. The horse snorted, pawing at the ground with such force that dust clouds rose around his hooves. 25? Folks, he's young and strong. Good breeding stock at the very least. From the back of the crowd, a man in a worn brown coat leaned heavily on a wooden cane. His weathered face remained impassive as he observed the scene, but his eyes, sharp and clear despite the lines of age around them, never left the stallion. Colonel James Hartford had seen enough fury in his 62 years to recognize it in man or beast. The rage in this horse wasn't born of meanness. It was born of pain. $5, came a mocking call from somewhere in the crowd. "I'll give you $5 if you throw in a bullet for when he tramples someone." Nervous laughter rippled through the gathering, but the auctioneer seized on the number. $5, I'm bid $5. Any advance on 5? The colonel raised his hand slightly, just enough to catch the auctioneer's eye. $5 to the gentleman in the back. Going once, going twice. Sold for $5. A collective sigh of relief went through the crowd as the horse was led away to a holding pen. Several people turned to stare at the old soldier. Some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled amusement. James Hartford paid them no mind. He'd been the subject of whispers since returning from the war, his medals and scars telling only half the story of what he'd endured. The young clerk at the payment counter looked up in surprise when James approached. "You're the one who bought the White Devil?" he asked, unable to hide his disbelief. "That would be me," James replied, placing 5 worn dollar bills on the counter. "Sir, I don't mean to overstep, but that horse, he's put 3 handlers in the hospital this week alone. The owner before you, Mr. Peterson, he was a hard man who believed any horse could be broken with enough force. When the horse nearly killed him, he brought him here to be rid of him." James nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "What's his name?" The clerk shrugged. "Don't think anyone bothered to give him one. Just called him that white bastard mostly." "I see." James signed the necessary paperwork with steady hands that belied his age. "I'll need him delivered to my place. I can't transport him myself anymore." He tapped his bad leg, a souvenir from Gettysburg that had never healed right. The clerk's eyes widened. "Sir, we usually have buyers arrange their own transport, especially for difficult cases." James fixed the young man with a steady gaze that had once commanded hundreds of men into battle. "Son, I just paid good money for that animal. Your auction house advertises delivery services. I expect those services to be rendered." An hour later, James stood at the gate of his modest farm as a reinforced trailer pulled up the dusty drive. The white stallion's screams of rage could be heard even before the vehicle came to a stop. Two nervous handlers emerged from the cab, looking as if they'd rather be anywhere else. "Where do you want him, Colonel?" one asked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. James gestured to a sturdy corral adjacent to the small barn. The fence was 8 feet tall with posts sunk deep into the ground, built years ago for a different purpose, but perfect for the current situation. "Just back the trailer up to that gate there and let him out. I'll take it from there." The men exchanged glances. "Sir, with all due respect, this horse needs at least 3 handlers, and even then—" "I appreciate your concern," James interrupted, his tone gentle but firm, "but I'll manage." The men did as instructed, though they took their time about it, clearly hoping the old soldier would reconsider. When they finally opened the trailer door, the white stallion exploded out like a cannonball, charging straight toward the far fence of the corral before wheeling around to face his captors, his sides heaving with exertion and fury. "Good Lord," one of the handlers whispered. "What are you planning to do with him, Colonel? He's not fit for riding or breeding with a temperament like that." James watched the horse pace the perimeter of the corral, testing the fence with occasional strikes of his hooves. "That's between him and me," he replied quietly. "You gentlemen can be on your way now. Thank you for your assistance." As the trailer disappeared down the drive, James remained at the corral fence, observing his new acquisition. The stallion stopped his pacing only long enough to stare back at the human, ears pinned flat against his head, eyes rolling to show the whites. "I know what you're feeling," James said, his voice soft but carrying in the quiet afternoon air. "Rage, pain, the certainty that everyone who approaches means you harm." He shifted his weight, easing the ache in his bad leg. "I know something about that." The horse snorted, tossing his head as if dismissing the human's words. "You don't believe me, that's fair, I wouldn't either." James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an apple, which he placed on the top rail of the fence before turning away. "I'll be back at sunset with some hay and water. For now, I'll leave you to settle in." As he limped back toward the small farmhouse that had been his sanctuary since returning from war, James felt the stallion's eyes on his back. He didn't look back. Some battles couldn't be won with confrontation. Some required patience, understanding, and the recognition of a kindred spirit. Inside his sparse kitchen, James put on a pot of coffee and sank into a chair by the window that overlooked the corral. The white stallion remained where he had left him, still as a statue except for the occasional twitch of his tail. James knew what the townspeople would say when word got around that old Colonel Hartford had finally lost his mind, throwing away money on a death wish with 4 legs. They wouldn't understand. How could they? The same darkness he saw in that horse's eyes greeted him in the mirror each morning. The same rage had once consumed him, nearly destroying everything he touched. If not for Captain Miller finding him in that field hospital, recognizing the man beneath the brokenness and having the patience to wait out the storm of his anger. James shook his head. Some debts couldn't be repaid to those who'd granted them. They could only be passed forward. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, James watched the stallion finally approach the apple he'd left. The horse sniffed it cautiously, then with a swift movement, snatched it from the fence and retreated to the far corner to eat. James smiled. It was a small victory, but in the war he was preparing to wage, every small victory mattered. This horse had known only cruelty from human hands. Changing that perception would take time, perhaps more time than an old soldier had left. But James Hartford had never been one to retreat from a worthy battle. "We'll start with a name," he murmured to himself as he watched the stallion pacing again, his movements slightly less frantic than before. Every soldier needs a name. Dawn broke over the Hartford farm with the soft golden light that only autumn brings. James had been awake for hours, watching the stallion from his kitchen window. The horse hadn't slept much either, pacing the corral with nervous energy, stopping occasionally to test the fence or to stare at the house as if sensing the human surveillance. James prepared himself a simple breakfast of coffee and toast before filling a bucket with fresh water and gathering an armful of hay. His movements were methodical, unhurried. Decades of military discipline had taught him that rushing often led to mistakes, and with a horse like this, mistakes could be fatal. As he approached the corral, the stallion's head shot up, ears pricked forward, then immediately flattening against his skull. The animal retreated to the far corner, muscles tensed and ready to charge. "Good morning to you too," James said, his voice pitched low and steady. He set the hay down outside the fence and entered through a smaller side gate, bucket in hand. The moment he stepped inside, the stallion pawed the ground, snorting a warning. James stopped, making himself as non-threatening as possible despite his considerable height. He stood quietly, not making eye contact, but watching the horse's body language from his peripheral vision. After a long moment, he took another step forward and set the water bucket down, then retreated to the gate. Only when he was outside the corral did he push the hay under the fence. "I'll leave you to your breakfast," he said, then turned and walked back to the house without looking back. From his window, he watched the stallion approach the water cautiously, drinking with nervous sips, always alert for any sign of danger. The hay remained untouched for over an hour before hunger finally overcame suspicion. James nodded to himself. "Small steps," he murmured. The routine continued for 3 days. Each morning and evening, James would bring water and hay, never staying longer than necessary, never making demands. On the 4th day, he added a brush to his supplies, which he simply set down inside the corral before leaving. The stallion investigated it from a distance, eventually knocking it over with his nose before retreating. On the 7th day, as James was setting down fresh water, a voice called from beyond the fence, "So it's true, you really did buy Peterson's killer horse." James straightened slowly, recognizing Dr. Samuel Bennett, the town's veterinarian, and one of the few people James might consider a friend. "Sam," he acknowledged with a nod. The veterinarian leaned against the fence, studying the white stallion who had retreated to the furthest corner at the new arrival's voice. "Magnificent animal," he commented, "if you can keep him from killing you." "That's the general plan." Sam snorted, a sound not unlike the stallion's. "Mind if I ask why? You've never struck me as a man with a death wish, James." James exited the corral carefully, latching the gate before answering. "He deserves a chance." "A chance? That horse has had plenty of chances. Peterson spent a small fortune trying to break him." Sam made quote marks in the air. "Hired every horse trainer in 3 counties. Last one ended up with a shattered collarbone." James glanced at the stallion, who was watching them intently. "Breaking is the problem. You can't break something that's already broken and expect it to work right afterward." Sam's expression softened. "You're seeing yourself in him, aren't you? Like after Antietam." James didn't answer directly. "Would you mind taking a look at him? From a distance, of course. I want to make sure he's not suffering from anything physical that might explain his behavior." Sam sighed but nodded. "Let me get my bag from the wagon." The examination, such as it was, consisted of Sam observing the stallion through field glasses while James stood quietly nearby. The horse remained alert but didn't charge as long as they stayed outside the fence. "From what I can see, his conformation is excellent," Sam finally said. "No obvious injuries or ailments, though I'd need to get closer to be certain. His coat shows signs of neglect, but that's to be expected given his history. If I had to guess, I'd say he's around 5 or 6 years old, probably from good bloodlines despite the lack of papers. And his temperament? Sam lowered the field glasses. Hard to say without knowing his past. Could be he was mishandled from the start, or maybe he suffered some trauma that turned him against humans. Not all scars are visible, as you well know. James nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to his leg where the Confederate bullet still resided, too close to an artery for doctors to risk removing it. "What's your plan?" Sam asked, packing away his equipment. "You can't exactly ride him." "No riding," James agreed. "Not for a long time, if ever. For now, I just want him to learn that not all humans bring pain." Sam studied his friend's face. "This isn't just about the horse, is it?" James finally met the veterinarian's gaze. "Is anything ever just about one thing, Sam?" The doctor clapped him on the shoulder. "I'll come by in a few days to check on both of you. Try not to get yourself killed in the meantime." After Sam departed, James returned to his daily chores, splitting wood for the coming winter, despite the protests of his bad leg. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, pushing away the memories that still haunted him 20 years after the war had ended. As he worked, he was conscious of the stallion watching him from the corral, those intelligent eyes following his every move. By evening, a light rain had begun to fall. James brought an extra ration of hay to the corral, and for the first time stood inside the gate longer than necessary, simply existing in the same space as the stallion. The horse maintained his distance but seemed less agitated than before. "You need a name," James said quietly, raindrops darkening his coat and hat. "Can't keep calling you horse or stallion." The white horse's ears flicked forward, catching the human's voice despite the patter of rain. "My commanding officer once told me that to name something is to acknowledge its spirit," James continued. "The right name has power. It recognizes what exists within." The stallion snorted, shaking water from his mane. "Ghost," James decided, "because that's what we both are, not fully here, not fully gone, caught between what was and what might be." The horse, Ghost, lifted his head slightly, as if considering this new sound. "Rest well, Ghost," James said, and left the corral. That night, as wind drove the rain against his bedroom window, James dreamed of battlefields and hospital tents, of men crying out in pain and fear. He awoke with a start, his nightshirt damp with sweat despite the autumn chill. A familiar feeling of suffocation gripped him, the weight of memories too heavy to bear alone. Following an old habit, he limped to the window and drew back the curtain. Outside, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning, stood Ghost, head high against the storm, his white coat gleaming like a beacon in the darkness. James watched him until his breathing steadied and the panic receded. Two survivors, weathering different storms but standing nonetheless. Before returning to bed, he whispered a promise to the night. "We'll make it through, Ghost, both of us." The next morning, James added a new element to their routine. After bringing fresh water and hay, he sat on an overturned bucket just inside the corral gate and began reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of The Odyssey. Ghost maintained his distance but seemed to relax as the steady cadence of James's voice filled the morning air. "The journey back from war," James explained between passages, "is sometimes harder than the war itself." Whether Ghost understood the words didn't matter. It was the connection that counted, the beginning of a bridge between two wounded souls. Autumn deepened, painting the countryside in brilliant hues of red and gold. James continued his daily ritual with Ghost, each morning and evening bringing food and water, then sitting on his bucket to read. Sometimes he chose poetry. Whitman was a favorite, and other times historical accounts or adventure stories. Ghost never approached during these sessions, But James noticed the stallion's ears would pivot toward his voice, and occasionally he would stop his pacing to listen. 2 weeks after Ghost's arrival, James introduced a new element to their routine. Instead of immediately leaving after reading, he brought out a curry comb and began grooming himself, brushing his coat sleeves, straightening his collar, and polishing his boots. It was an odd sight, an aging colonel performing his military ablutions in a muddy corral, while a wild horse watched from a distance. But there was method to his apparent madness. "Grooming is comfort," he explained to Ghost, who observed with cautious interest. "For soldiers, for gentlemen, and for horses. When the world is chaos, there's peace in the ritual." James repeated this performance for 3 days before leaving the curry comb on the ground near the center of the corral. Each day, he moved it slightly closer to where Ghost usually stood. By the 5th day, the stallion's curiosity overcame his caution. When James returned that evening, he found the curry comb had been moved, bearing teeth marks around its wooden handle. Progress came slowly, measured in inches rather than miles. By the end of the first month, Ghost would eat while James sat reading, though he maintained a careful distance of at least 20 feet. By week 6, that distance had decreased to 15 feet. Never once did James attempt to approach the stallion directly or force any interaction. "Patience," James told Sam during one of the veterinarian's regular visits. "War taught me that rushing toward an objective often leads to unnecessary casualties." Sam leaned against his wagon, watching James split firewood. "And what exactly is your objective with Ghost? You've spent nearly 2 months now. He's eating better, looks healthier, but he's still essentially a wild animal living in your corral." James set down his axe and wiped sweat from his brow despite the November chill. "My objective?" he repeated, glancing toward the white horse who was watching them from his usual spot. "To give him the choice I never had." "Which was?" "To decide for himself whether humans are worth trusting again." Sam's expression softened. "You know, most people would have given up by now or resorted to traditional breaking methods." James's jaw tightened. "I've seen enough breaking in my lifetime. Does more harm than good, especially when what's broken is the spirit." Word of the colonel's unusual project had spread through town, becoming something of a local curiosity. Occasionally, riders would detour past the Hartford farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous white stallion and the old soldier's unorthodox methods. James ignored these spectators, but Ghost grew visibly agitated whenever strangers appeared, confirming James's suspicion that the horse's fear of humans was deeply ingrained. The first real breakthrough came on a bitter, cold morning in early December. James arrived at the corral to find Ghost huddled against the wind, ice crystals forming in his mane. The barn, with its promise of shelter, remained unexplored territory. Ghost had refused to enter the unfamiliar structure despite the increasingly harsh weather. "Stubborn fool," James muttered, though whether he meant Ghost or himself was unclear. He opened the barn doors wide, spread fresh straw inside, and placed Ghost's hay near the entrance. Instead of leaving as usual, James sat down just inside the barn, wrapped in his heavy military coat, and began to read. An hour passed, then 2. James's voice grew hoarse, and his bad leg ached fiercely from the cold. But still he read. Ghost remained in his corner, visibly shivering now as the wind picked up. "Your choice," James finally said, closing his book. "Freedom includes the freedom to be miserable, I suppose." He stood with difficulty, his stiff leg nearly buckling. As he turned to leave, a sound made him pause, the soft nicker of a horse, almost inaudible above the wind. When James glanced back, Ghost had taken several steps toward the barn, his ears forward, nostrils testing the air. James remained perfectly still. "It's warmer inside," he said quietly. "No tricks, no ropes, just shelter." After what seemed an eternity, Ghost took another tentative step forward, then another. James backed deeper into the barn, creating space. With halting progress, the stallion approached the open doors, pausing at the threshold as if crossing it would seal some irrevocable pact. A powerful gust of wind made the decision easier. Ghost entered with a sudden burst of movement, quickly positioning himself in the corner furthest from James but undeniably inside the barn. James nodded once, satisfied, and departed without fanfare, leaving the doors wide open. From his kitchen window, he watched as Ghost remained inside, cautiously exploring his new surroundings, but never venturing back into the bitter cold. That night, as snow began to fall, James returned to close the upper portion of the barn doors, leaving the lower half open so Ghost wouldn't feel trapped. The stallion watched warily from his corner, but made no move to flee, seeming to understand that the human's actions were providing protection from the elements. "Progress," James murmured as he latched the doors. The following morning, Sam arrived with supplies from town, his wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow. He found James splitting wood despite the weather, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You're going to work yourself into pneumonia," Sam chided, helping unload the supplies. "Where's your four-legged project?" James gestured toward the barn with his axe. Decided civilization has some advantages after all. Sam's eyebrows shot up. He went in willingly. His choice entirely. They walked to the barn together, James moving carefully on the slippery ground. Inside, Ghost stood alert, but didn't retreat to his corner, as he had in the past. Instead, he watched them with what almost appeared to be curiosity rather than fear. "Well, I'll be damned," Sam whispered. "He looks different." James nodded, understanding exactly what his friend meant. The wild desperation that had characterized Ghost's demeanor was less pronounced. The stallion still held himself with caution, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a horse considering possibilities rather than merely anticipating threats. "I've been thinking," James said as they walked back to the house. "Come spring, he'll need more space. The corral is sufficient for now, but a horse like that needs room to run." Sam gave him a sideways look. "You're talking about letting him loose after all this work?" "Not loose, free. There's a difference." "And how do you figure that?" James paused, looking back at the barn where Ghost now sheltered. "Freedom isn't about absence of connections, Sam. It's about having the right ones, bonds that strengthen rather than confine." He tapped his leg absently. "Took me long enough to learn that myself." That evening, as darkness fell and the snowfall intensified, James sat by his fireplace, nursing a cup of coffee laced with a splash of whiskey. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending drafts through the old farmhouse. He thought of Ghost alone in the barn but sheltered from the storm, and wondered if the stallion understood what had transpired today, that he had for the first time chosen to trust a human's provision rather than rely solely on his own instincts. Small victories, James reminded himself. In war and in peace, they all added up eventually. Winter settled over the Hartford farm like a heavy blanket, silencing the world beneath layers of snow and ice. For James, the season brought familiar challenges, the constant ache in his leg intensified by the cold, the isolation as roads became difficult to traverse, and the long nights that too often filled with memories he'd rather forget. But this winter differed from those past. This winter, he had purpose. Each morning, James would make his way through the snow to the barn, carrying feed and fresh water for Ghost. The stallion had fully acclimated to the shelter, though he remained vigilant whenever James entered. A routine had developed between them. James would place the food and water in their designated spots, then sit on a hay bale near the door, reading aloud for half an hour before departing. Ghost no longer retreated to the corner during these visits, instead standing at a comfortable middle distance, ears forward, listening. One particularly bitter January morning, as James read from Moby Dick, his voice suddenly faltered. The pain in his leg had flared unexpectedly, causing him to grimace and shift position. He paused, breathing deeply through the spasm that radiated from thigh to ankle. "Just need a moment," he murmured, more to himself than to Ghost. When he looked up, he found the stallion watching him intently, head lowered slightly, nostrils flared as if scenting the air for signs of threat. But there was something else in his posture, a subtle shift that James, with his decades of horsemanship before the war, recognized as curiosity rather than fear. "Old wounds," James explained, rubbing his thigh. "They have their own weather patterns, storms coming if my leg's any judge." Ghost took a single step forward, then stopped, as if testing a boundary. James remained perfectly still, continuing to speak in the same conversational tone. "Captain Miller used to say scars were just the body's way of keeping score. Trouble is, not all the important ones show on the surface." Another step from Ghost, cautious but deliberate. James kept talking, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "You understand that, don't you? Your scars are invisible too, but they're there all the same." Ghost was now close enough that James could feel the warmth of his breath in the cold air of the barn. 10 feet, then 8. The stallion paused again, muscles tensed, as if ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Slowly, telegraphing his movements, James extended his open palm, not reaching toward the horse but simply offering. Ghost's ears flicked back momentarily, but he didn't retreat. For nearly a minute they remained frozen in this tableau, an old soldier with his hand outstretched, and a wild stallion considering a trust he'd never before granted. Ghost lowered his head, neck extended, and for one heart-stopping moment James thought he might actually make contact. Instead, the stallion snorted softly and backed away, returning to his usual spot across the barn. James lowered his hand, a smile tugging at his weathered features. "That's all right," he said. "Small victories." As predicted, a blizzard descended that afternoon, confining James to the house. Through snow-blurred windows, he kept watch on the barn, concerned about Ghost's reaction to the howling wind and creaking timbers. When the storm abated the following morning, he made his way through knee-deep drifts, uncertain what he would find. To his relief, Ghost appeared unperturbed by the weather, greeting James with a soft nicker that surprised them both. It was the first voluntary vocalization the stallion had directed toward him, another small victory to mark in the ledger of their gradually evolving relationship. February brought a different kind of challenge. While repairing a broken hinge on the barn door, James slipped on a patch of ice, falling hard against the wooden frame. The impact wasn't serious, but his involuntary cry of pain and the clatter of dropped tools sent Ghost into a panic. In an instant, all their careful progress seemed to vanish as the stallion reverted to his previous state of terror, kicking at his stall and baring his teeth when James attempted to approach. "Back to square one," James muttered that evening, nursing a bruised shoulder and wounded pride as he watched Ghost from a distance, the stallion still agitated hours after the incident. But the following day proved him wrong. Though Ghost remained more cautious than before, he didn't flee when James entered with feed. By the third day, their routine had mostly resumed, albeit with a greater distance between them. "You're more resilient than I gave you credit for," James told Ghost as February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to emerge from beneath the snow. "Setbacks don't defeat you for long." Sam's visits, which had been sporadic during the worst of winter, became regular again as the roads cleared. He marveled at the changes in Ghost, the improved physical condition, the calmer demeanor, and most significantly, the way the stallion now acknowledged James with attentive ears and watchful eyes rather than fearful aggression. "I've got to hand it to you," Sam admitted during one visit, keeping his voice low as they observed Ghost from outside the barn. "I thought you were chasing windmills when you bought him." Never imagined he could become this civilized. James shook his head. Not civilized, healing. There's a difference. Still think you'll turn him loose come summer? James considered the question. That's still the plan. He deserves to choose his own path. Sam's expression was skeptical. And if he chooses to leave, all this work for nothing? Not for nothing, James replied. Freedom only means something if it includes the freedom to leave. As March progressed, bringing muddy fields and the first green shoots, James began the next phase of his plan. Each day after their usual morning ritual, he would lead Ghost on a long rope through the corral and into the fallow south field. The first attempts were tense affairs, Ghost balking at the unfamiliar territory, James patiently waiting him out. But soon the stallion began to anticipate these excursions, standing ready at the gate when James appeared with the lead rope. On these walks, James would continue his one-sided conversations, telling Ghost about the farm's history, his experiences in the war, and his plans for the coming planting season. Whether the horse understood didn't matter. It was the tone that counted, the consistent gentleness that contradicted everything Ghost had previously experienced from human handlers. By the end of March, James had expanded their walking territory to include the entire southern portion of his property, a stretch of about 15 acres bordered by a stream on one side and a line of oak trees on the other. Ghost moved more freely here, sometimes ranging ahead on the long lead, sometimes walking almost at James's shoulder. During one such walk, as they paused by the stream swollen with spring runoff, James noticed Ghost, watching a distant herd of deer moving through the trees at the property line. The stallion's posture had changed, his head high, ears pricked forward, nostrils wide to catch the scent of his wild cousins. "Missing your freedom?" James asked softly. Ghost turned at the sound of his voice, regarding James with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations within them. "Soon enough," James promised. "When you're ready. When we're both ready." April arrived with a riot of green and the sweet scent of apple blossoms from the small orchard behind James's house. As the land awakened from its winter slumber, Ghost seemed to undergo a transformation of his own. His coat, now properly shed of its winter fullness, gleamed like polished marble in the spring sunshine. His eyes, once wild with fear and rage, had softened. Not tame, never that, but possessed of a watchful intelligence that assessed rather than merely reacted. Their daily walks had become the cornerstone of both their routines. James found himself anticipating these excursions as much for his own sake as for Ghost's. There was something meditative about moving across the awakening land with the stallion at his side, connected by nothing more than a loose lead rope that James rarely needed to pull taut. "You know," James remarked one morning as they crossed the greening south field, "I haven't read to you in nearly a week. Seems you prefer these conversations, one-sided though they may be." Ghost flicked an ear in his direction, but continued walking steadily alongside him, occasionally lowering his head to sample the new grass. The change hadn't escaped Sam's notice during his regular visits. "Almost like you've got a different horse," he commented, watching James and Ghost return from their morning walk. "If I hadn't seen him when he first arrived, I'd never believe this was the same animal that put 3 handlers in the hospital." James merely nodded, unhooking the lead rope from Ghost's halter, another small victory achieved in recent weeks. The stallion no longer needed to be led back to the corral. He would follow James of his own accord, stopping only to investigate interesting scents or sounds along the way. "Peterson came by my office yesterday," Sam continued, his tone casual, but his eyes watchful for James's reaction. "Asked about his old horse." James's hand stilled on the gate latch. "Did he now?" "Said he heard you'd tamed the White Devil, as he put it. Wanted to know if you'd be interested in selling him back." A muscle twitched in James's jaw. "And what did you tell him?" "That he'd have to speak to you directly, though I did mention you weren't likely to be interested." James nodded, satisfied. You told him true. The mention of Peterson cast a shadow over the remainder of the day. James found himself watching the road more often, half expecting to see the man's wagon approaching. Peterson had a reputation as someone who didn't easily accept being bested, particularly by a man he likely viewed as nothing more than a crippled old soldier playing at horse training. The anticipated visit came 3 days later. James was splitting wood in the yard when the sound of an approaching wagon reached him. Ghost, grazing in the adjacent corral, raised his head at the noise, ears pricking forward, then flattening against his skull. James set down his axe and placed a reassuring hand on the corral fence. Easy now, he murmured. No need for alarm. Peterson's wagon rounded the bend in the drive, pulled by a matched pair of bay geldings that showed signs of both quality breeding and harsh handling. The man himself was thick-bodied and florid-faced, dressed in clothes that proclaimed his wealth but couldn't disguise his coarse nature. "Colonel Hartford," Peterson called out with false joviality as he pulled the wagon to a halt. "Fine spring day, isn't it?" James nodded but didn't return the greeting, watching as Peterson's gaze moved past him to where Ghost stood at the far end of the corral. "I see you've managed to keep him alive," Peterson remarked, climbing down from the wagon with the stiff movements of a man unaccustomed to physical labor. "More than I expected, truth be told." "Did you come for a reason, Mr. Peterson, or just to admire my horse?" Peterson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Straight to business, then. I like that." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded banknote. "I've come to buy back what's mine. $200, 40 times what you paid. Generous offer, considering." "Considering what?" "Considering he's still the same devil underneath whatever spell you've cast on him. He'll turn on you eventually. They always do." James regarded the man steadily. "He's not for sale." Peterson's smile faltered. "Now, Colonel, don't be hasty. 300 then. That's more than fair." "It's not a matter of price, Mr. Peterson. Ghost isn't for sale at any amount." "Ghost?" Peterson scoffed. "You name that killer Ghost?" James didn't respond, watching as Peterson's expression darkened from frustration to anger. "Look here, Hartford. That horse was mine. I spent good money breeding and raising him before he went bad. He's valuable stock, and I've got buyers interested in his bloodlines." "For breeding?" James asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "Or for fighting pits?" Peterson's momentary hesitation told James all he needed to know. There were rumors about Peterson's involvement in the illegal horse-fighting rings that operated in the shadows of legitimate racing circuits. The thought of Ghost or any horse being forced into such brutality made James's blood run cold. "What you did with him before is your business," James said, his voice deceptively calm. "What happens to him now is mine, and I'm telling you he's not for sale." Peterson's face reddened further. "You self-righteous old fool, you think you've reformed him, turned him into some kind of pet?" He gestured toward Ghost, who was watching them intently from across the corral. "He's a killer, always will be, and when he tramples you to death, I'll buy him from your estate for less than I'm offering now." James stepped closer, and something in his demeanor made Peterson take an involuntary step back. Though well into his 60s, the colonel still carried himself with the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded others in battle. "Mr. Peterson," James said quietly, "I suggest you leave my property. Now." For a moment, it seemed Peterson might argue further, but whatever he saw in the old soldier's eyes made him reconsider. He climbed back onto his wagon with as much dignity as he could muster. "This isn't the end of it, Hartford," he called as he turned the wagon around. "That horse belongs with someone who understands his true nature." James watched until the wagon disappeared around the bend before turning back to the corral. Ghost had moved closer during the confrontation, standing now at the fence nearest to where James and Peterson had been speaking. "His true nature," James murmured, reaching out slowly to touch Ghost's neck. To his surprise, the stallion didn't flinch away, as if he knows the first thing about it. That evening, as twilight settled over the farm, James sat on the porch steps, a glass of whiskey in hand. The encounter with Peterson had stirred memories he'd rather have left undisturbed. Echoes of officers who had viewed their men as mere tools, disposable assets in the machinery of war. A soft nicker drew his attention. Ghost stood at the corral fence watching him in the fading light. James raised his glass in a silent toast. "To true natures," he said, "and the freedom to discover them for ourselves." Ghost's answering snort almost sounded like agreement. May brought with it the kind of perfect days that seemed to exist purely to remind people why they endured winter's harshness. Fields erupted with wildflowers, birds returned to nest in the eaves of James's barn, and the apple trees in his small orchard shed their blossoms in favor of tiny green fruits that promised a bountiful harvest come fall. Ghost, too, seemed to flourish in the warming days. His coat gleamed with health. His movements became more fluid. And, most remarkably to James, he had begun to seek out human contact rather than merely tolerate it. Small gestures at first, approaching when James entered the corral rather than waiting to be approached, lowering his head to be scratched behind the ears, following James around the barnyard without a lead rope. One particularly fine morning in mid-May, James decided to try something new. After their usual breakfast routine, instead of attaching the lead rope to Ghost's halter for their morning walk, he simply opened the corral gate and stepped back. "Your choice," he told the stallion. "Follow or stay." Ghost hesitated at the threshold, clearly puzzled by this deviation from their established pattern. He took a tentative step forward, then stopped, looking at James as if seeking confirmation. "It's all right," James said, his voice gentle. "I'll be walking to the south field either way. You're welcome to join me." With that, he turned and began walking down the familiar path, his gait slightly uneven due to his bad leg, but his pace steady. He didn't look back, though every fiber of his being wanted to. This moment, this choice, was crucial to everything he'd been working toward with Ghost. The soft sound of hoofbeats on earth told him his gamble had paid off before he'd gone 20 yards. Ghost trotted up beside him, matching his pace with an almost deliberate precision, careful not to overtake or crowd him. "Good man," James said quietly, not reaching for the horse but acknowledging his presence with a nod. They walked all the way to the stream that marked the southern boundary of James's property, Ghost occasionally ranging ahead or stopping to graze, but always returning to James's side. When they reached the stream, James sat on a fallen log while Ghost drank from the clear water. "You know," James said conversationally, "after Gettysburg they wanted to amputate this leg." He tapped his bad leg, as had become his habit when discussing it. "Surgeon said the bullet was too close to the artery to risk removing it, but the wound was going gangrenous. Said cutting it off was my only chance." Ghost raised his dripping muzzle from the stream, ears pivoting toward James's voice. "Captain Miller wouldn't hear of it. Argued with the surgeon for an hour, then sat with me all night cleaning the wound with whiskey and changing the dressings. Said he'd seen men recover from worse and I'd need both legs if I was going to lead the regiment again." James smiled at the memory, though it was tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that Miller hadn't survived the war himself, falling at Cold Harbor just a year later. He was right about the leg, as it turned out. Wrong about me leading the regiment again, though. Some wounds don't show on the surface. James gazed across the stream to the untamed land beyond. "Sometimes I wonder what I might have become if not for the war. If I'd have had a family, raised children on this farm instead of living alone with memories for company." Ghost approached slowly, standing close enough now that James could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Without thinking, James reached up and placed his hand on the stallion's neck. Ghost tensed momentarily but didn't pull away. "Suppose there's no use in wondering about paths not taken," James continued, his hand resting lightly on Ghost's warm coat. "All we can do is walk the one we're on as best we can." They remained like that for several minutes, man and horse connected in a moment of quiet understanding, before beginning the journey back to the farm. The idyll of their peaceful morning was shattered upon their return. As they crested the small rise that overlooked the farm, James spotted 2 wagons in his yard. One belonged to Sam. The other, James recognized with a surge of anger, was Peterson's. Ghost must have sensed the change in James's demeanor, for he halted abruptly, ears flattened against his skull. The stallion's eyes were fixed on the wagons, his body tense with recognition. "Easy," James murmured, though his own heart had begun to pound uncomfortably. "Let's see what this is about." As they approached, Sam spotted them first, relief evident in his face as he hurried toward them. He was followed more slowly by Peterson and another man James didn't recognize, a heavy-set individual with the unmistakable look of legal authority about him. "James," Sam called out, "been looking for you. Sheriff Donovan here has some questions about your horse." James nodded a greeting to the sheriff, but kept his eyes on Peterson, whose smug expression told James everything he needed to know about the reason for this visit. "Colonel Hartford," Sheriff Donovan began, his tone respectful but firm, "Mr. Peterson here has filed a complaint claiming that the horse in your possession was stolen from his property, not sold at auction as you claim." "That's a lie," James replied calmly. "I purchased Ghost legally at the county auction 6 months ago. There are records to prove it." Peterson stepped forward, his face flushed with either anger or drink, possibly both. "That auction was conducted under false pretenses. My men were supposed to take the horse to be destroyed, not sold. He's dangerous, a killer, and selling him was a mistake that puts everyone at risk." "Including the poor fool who bought him," added Peterson's companion, a thin man with a calculating gaze who had remained by the wagon. Though perhaps $5 was a fair price for a death sentence. Ghost, who had been watching the confrontation with growing agitation, suddenly reared up with a loud whinny of distress. The sheriff's hand moved instinctively to his gun, and Peterson's companion took a hasty step back. "See!" Peterson exclaimed. "He's still a devil. Look at him." But James had stepped directly in front of Ghost, his back to the stallion, facing the men. "Lower your hand, Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command. "Slowly now. You're frightening him." To everyone's surprise, including James's, Ghost calmed immediately, lowering himself back to all fours and moving to stand beside James rather than behind him, as if presenting a united front. The sheriff stared, his hand dropping away from his gun. "That horse nearly killed 3 men, according to the complaint." "Under Peterson's handling, yes," James replied. "But as you can see, he's hardly the uncontrollable killer being described." Sam stepped forward, his expression serious. "Sheriff, I've been visiting this farm regularly since the colonel acquired the horse. I can attest to the remarkable improvement in the animal's temperament under his care." Sheriff Donovan looked from Sam to James to Peterson, clearly weighing the contradictory claims. Finally, his gaze settled on Ghost, standing calmly beside James despite the tension-filled atmosphere. "Mr. Peterson," the sheriff said slowly, "Colonel Hartford appears to have legal ownership papers from the county auction, and the horse doesn't seem to be the immediate danger you described. Unless you have documentation proving prior ownership and evidence of fraud in the sale, I don't see grounds for further action." Peterson's face darkened with rage. "This isn't over, Hartford," he spat before turning on his heel and storming back to his wagon. As the dust from Peterson's departing wagon settled, Sam let out a low whistle. He's not one to give up easily. No, James agreed, stroking Ghost's neck absently, and neither am I. The weeks following Peterson's visit with the sheriff brought a wary vigilance to the Hartford farm. James took to carrying his old service revolver when working in the fields, and he spent more time than usual watching the road from his porch in the evenings. Ghost, too, seemed affected by the confrontation, growing skittish at the sound of approaching wagons and watching the farm's boundaries with suspicious eyes. Despite these tensions, May gave way to June, and their progress together continued. James had taken to leaving the corral gate open during daylight hours, allowing Ghost to come and go as he pleased. To his quiet satisfaction, the stallion rarely ventured far from wherever James was working, whether splitting wood by the barn, tending his vegetable garden, or mending fences in the far pasture. "He's like your shadow," Sam remarked during a visit in mid-June. They were sitting on James's porch, nursing glasses of lemonade, while Ghost grazed peacefully in the yard nearby. "Never seen anything like it, especially with a horse that was so wild to begin with." James nodded, watching Ghost with quiet pride. "We understand each other." "Peterson's been making noise in town," Sam said after a pause, his tone casual but his eyes watchful, "telling anyone who will listen that you've stolen his valuable breeding stock, that you've got no right to keep the horse." James's jaw tightened. "Ghost is exactly where he belongs." "I know that, but Peterson's got friends in high places and he's not one to let things go." Sam leaned forward, lowering his voice, though there was no one else to hear. "Word is he's been talking to Judge Crawford. You know, they're old hunting companions." James did know. Judge Crawford was the county's senior magistrate, a man with considerably more authority than the local sheriff. If Peterson managed to convince him that Ghost had been wrongfully sold at auction. "What would you have me do, Sam? Return Ghost to a man who abused him, who plans to use him for illegal fighting pits?" Sam sighed, shaking his head. "Of course not. I'm just saying you should be prepared. Maybe consider moving Ghost somewhere else for a while, just until this blows over." The suggestion, though practical, sent a chill through James. The thought of sending Ghost away, even temporarily, felt like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. "This is his home now," James said firmly. "I won't uproot him because of Peterson's threats." Sam didn't argue further, but his worried expression remained as he departed that afternoon, promising to keep his ears open in town for any developments. That evening, as twilight painted the farm in soft purple shadows, James sat on the porch steps with his ledger open on his knee. The farm's finances were adequate but not abundant. If legal troubles came, his resources to fight them would be limited. Perhaps Sam was right about moving Ghost, at least until... A soft nickering interrupted his thoughts. Ghost had approached the porch and was standing at the bottom step, his intelligent eyes fixed on James with an expression that almost looked like concern. "It's all right," James told him, setting aside the ledger. "Just wrestling with human problems. Nothing for you to worry about." But as he studied the stallion's powerful frame, now healthy and strong after months of proper care, an idea began to form in his mind. If Peterson wanted Ghost for breeding, it was because he recognized the stallion's exceptional qualities, the same qualities that James had come to admire over their months together. Perhaps there was a way to secure Ghost's future that would benefit them both. The county fair was scheduled for the first week of July, just 3 weeks away. It included, among other events, a series of competitions for local horses, races, jumping contests, and exhibitions of training and temperament. The prizes were modest, but the recognition could be valuable, especially for breeding prospects. James had attended the fair every year since returning from the war, but always as a spectator, never as a participant. The thought of entering Ghost in competition would have seemed laughable just a few months ago. Now, though... "What do you think?" he asked Ghost, who had moved closer to nudge James's shoulder with his soft muzzle. "Are you ready to show the county what you're capable of when treated with respect?" The next morning, James began Ghost's preparation in earnest. Their daily walks extended into light training sessions, with James teaching basic commands and introducing Ghost to obstacles similar to those they might encounter at the fair. To his delight, the stallion proved not just willing but eager to learn, his intelligence and athleticism making him a quick study. The first time James attempted to mount Ghost was a tense moment for them both. They had progressed to the point where Ghost accepted a saddle without protest, but the weight and presence of a rider was an entirely different matter. James approached it methodically, first leaning his weight against Ghost's side, then placing his foot in the stirrup without mounting, then lifting himself slightly before returning to the ground. Ghost remained calm through it all, though his muscles tensed with each new step. When James finally eased himself fully into the saddle, he held his breath, half expecting the stallion to explode into the bucking fury that had earned him his dangerous reputation. Instead, Ghost stood perfectly still, his ears flicking back to catch James's voice as the old soldier praised him softly. "Good man," James murmured, patting Ghost's neck. "Now let's try a step forward." Their first ride was brief, just a slow walk around the corral, but it represented a milestone that James had once thought impossible. As he dismounted, he leaned forward and rested his forehead briefly against Ghost's neck, overwhelmed by a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank you for trusting me," he whispered. The days that followed saw rapid progress as Ghost's natural athleticism and intelligence merged with his growing trust in James. Soon they were cantering across the south field together, James's bad leg awkward in the stirrup, but his seat secure from years of cavalry experience. Ghost moved beneath him with a power and grace that made James's heart soar, the rhythm of hoofbeats against earth drowning out the persistent ache of old wounds. One evening, as James was brushing Ghost down after a particularly good training session, the distant sound of an approaching wagon made them both pause. Ghost's ears pricked forward, but he showed none of the fear that similar sounds had triggered in the past. "Progress," James murmured, continuing the brushing strokes. The wagon came into view around the bend in the drive, not Peterson's, as James had half feared, but an unfamiliar one driven by a young man in his 20s. He pulled up in front of the house and climbed down, approaching with the careful respect of someone aware of the property's boundaries. "Colonel Hartford?" he called, stopping at a polite distance. "That's me," James acknowledged, stepping out of the barn with Ghost following close behind. The young man removed his hat. "I'm Michael Crawford, sir, Judge Crawford's son. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I heard in town that you've been working with the White Stallion from the Peterson place." James tensed at the mention of both Peterson and Judge Crawford, but kept his expression neutral. "That's right." Michael's eyes were fixed on Ghost with an expression of undisguised admiration. "They say you've accomplished what no one else could, that you've gentled him without breaking his spirit. I was hoping. That is, I'm studying veterinary medicine, and I've always been interested in horse behavior. I wondered if you might allow me to observe your methods." The request caught James by surprise. "Does your father know you're here?" A flash of something, defiance perhaps, crossed the young man's face. "My father and Mr. Peterson are old friends, but that doesn't mean I share his opinions. I believe animals deserve to be treated with respect, not force." James studied him for a moment longer, then made his decision. "Come back tomorrow morning. We'll be working on jumps in the south field." Michael's face lit up. "Thank you, sir. I'll be here." As the young man's wagon disappeared down the drive, James turned to Ghost. Seems we're acquiring an audience for our fair preparations. Let's make sure we give him something worth watching. Michael Crawford proved to be an eager and attentive student. He arrived at the Hartford farm each morning promptly at 7, notebook in hand, ready to observe James and Ghost at work. His questions were thoughtful, his observations astute, and James found himself unexpectedly enjoying the young man's company. "It's remarkable," Michael said one morning as they watched Ghost navigate a series of low jumps James had constructed in the south field. "Most trainers would have used force to achieve half of what you've accomplished through patience." James nodded, leaning on his cane as Ghost completed the course and trotted back toward them, head high and ears forward. "Force might get temporary compliance, but it destroys trust. Without trust, you have nothing worth having." "My father doesn't see it that way," Michael admitted, his expression clouding. "He believes discipline is the only language animals truly understand." "And Peterson?" Michael hesitated before answering. "Mr. Peterson shares my father's views, but takes them further. I've seen his methods with horses there." He trailed off, seemingly unable to find appropriate words. "Cruel," James supplied, watching Ghost approach. "You can say it." "Yes," Michael agreed quietly. "Cruel." As June waned and the county fair drew nearer, word of James's work with the infamous killer horse spread through town. Occasionally, curious onlookers would appear at the edge of his property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the white stallion that had supposedly been transformed from a monster into a show horse. James tolerated these spectators as long as they maintained a respectful distance, understanding that in a small community, unusual events were rare and precious forms of entertainment. What he couldn't tolerate, however, were the rumors that began to circulate. Whispers that he had used unnatural methods to tame Ghost, that the horse was drugged, or that James possessed some kind of mystical ability to bend animals to his will. "Absurd," he muttered to Sam after hearing the latest variation of these tales. "As if there's anything magical about basic decency and patience." Sam shrugged, helping James load supplies into his wagon for the trip to town. "People prefer mysteries to simple truths. Easier to believe in magic than to accept that kindness works better than cruelty, especially for those who've built their lives around the latter." The reference to Peterson wasn't subtle, and it brought a fresh concern to James's mind. "Has Peterson made any further moves with the judge?" "Not that I've heard," Sam replied. "Though Michael's regular visits to your farm haven't gone unnoticed. Judge Crawford isn't pleased about his son fraternizing with, how did he put it, a stubborn old soldier refusing to respect property rights." James snorted. "Property rights. As if Ghost were a piece of furniture." "To men like Peterson and Crawford, that's exactly what he is," Sam said grimly. "A possession valued only for what can be gained from him." That evening, after Michael had departed and the day's training was complete, James sat on the porch with Ghost standing quietly beside him. The stallion had taken to joining him during these twilight reflections, sometimes dozing lightly, sometimes watching the horizon as James did, as if they were sentinels guarding the same territory. "1 week until the fair," James said, absently stroking Ghost's neck. "Think you're ready to show the county what you're made of?" Ghost nickered softly, pressing his muzzle against James's shoulder in a gesture that had become familiar between them. "I'll take that as a yes," James chuckled. The morning of the fair dawned clear and warm, perfect weather for the festivities that would bring together families from across the county. James rose earlier than usual, his stomach tight with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Today would be Ghost's first true test in public, surrounded by crowds, noises, and unfamiliar horses. More importantly, it would be a test of everything they had built together over the past 7 months. "No turning back now," James murmured as he saddled Ghost in the pre-dawn light. The stallion stood calmly, occasionally turning his head to watch James's movements with curious eyes. The fairgrounds were located on the outskirts of town, about an hour's ride from the Hartford farm. James had considered transporting Ghost by wagon, but ultimately decided that riding would be better, less stressful for the horse, and a good warm-up before the competitions. As they set out, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, casting long shadows across the fields and turning Ghost's white coat to silver in the half-light. James kept their pace easy, wanting to conserve Ghost's energy for the day ahead. The stallion moved with confident strides, his ears pricked forward in interest rather than pinned back in fear, as they had been during his first journeys away from the farm. They were within sight of town when they encountered their first test, a group of farm workers heading to the fields with wagons and equipment. In the past, such an encounter might have sent Ghost into a panic, but today he merely slowed his pace, watching the approaching wagons with cautious interest. "Good man," James praised quietly, patting the stallion's neck. "Nothing to fear." One of the workers recognized James and called out a greeting. "Morning, Colonel. That the white devil I've been hearing about?" "His name is Ghost," James corrected, keeping his tone friendly but firm. "And he's a gentleman now, as you can see." The men laughed appreciatively, tipping their hats as James and Ghost continued on their way. It was a small exchange, but it filled James with quiet pride. Every peaceful interaction was another step in Ghost's rehabilitation in the eyes of the community. The fairgrounds were already bustling when they arrived. Colorful tents and stalls lined the central area, while temporary corrals and a show ring had been set up in the adjacent field. The air was filled with the mingled scents of livestock, fresh hay, cooking food, and the indefinable excitement of a community gathering. Ghost tensed as they approached, his stride shortening and his ears swiveling to catch the cacophony of unfamiliar sounds. James could feel the stallion's muscles bunching beneath him, ready for flight if necessary. "Steady now," he murmured, keeping his own body relaxed in the saddle, his hands soft on the reins. "I'm right here with you." They paused at the edge of the grounds, allowing Ghost time to absorb the scene before proceeding. Gradually, the stallion's breathing slowed, and his posture relaxed. James gave him a reassuring pat before guiding him forward into the crowd. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Heads turned as the majestic white stallion made his way through the fairgrounds, his coat gleaming in the morning sun, his gait proud and measured despite the stimulation around him. Whispers followed in their wake. "That's Hartford's horse. The killer from the Peterson place. Look how he's changed." Sam met them near the registration tent, his face breaking into a wide smile at the sight of them. "You made it. And without incident, I see." "So far, so good," James agreed, dismounting carefully to spare his bad leg. "How's the competition looking?" Sam's expression turned serious. "Peterson's here. Entered 3 horses in various events, including a black stallion in the same jumping competition you registered for." James nodded, unsurprised. "And Judge Crawford?" "Serving as one of the judges for the horse competitions, as he does every year." Sam lowered his voice. "Michael warned me that his father's been in Peterson's ear all week. They're expecting, hoping, Ghost will revert to his old ways in public." James stroked Ghost's neck, feeling the stallion's warmth beneath his palm. "Then we'll just have to disappoint them, won't we?" The county fair buzzed with the energy of celebration. Children darted between stalls with sticky-fingered excitement. Farmers compared crops and livestock with good-natured competitiveness, and young couples strolled arm in arm beneath strings of colored lanterns. In years past, James had found comfort in the anonymity of these gatherings, another face in the crowd observing rather than participating. Today was different. Today, all eyes seemed to follow the white stallion who stood calmly beside him as they waited for the jumping competition to begin. Quite a turnout, Sam commented, surveying the crowd that had gathered around the show ring. Word spread about Ghost. Everyone wants to see if the reformed killer will live up to the rumors. James nodded, running a hand along Ghost's neck. The stallion's muscles were taut but not trembling, his ears alert but not flattened in fear. Despite the noise and movement surrounding them, Ghost remained focused on James, responding to his touch with a gentle lowering of his head. "Colonel Hartford." The familiar voice made James turn. Peterson stood a few yards away, leading a gleaming black stallion whose coat had clearly been polished to intimidation. The animal was magnificent. Powerful shoulders, deep chest, strong legs, but James noted the tightness in its jaw, the way it flinched almost imperceptibly when Peterson adjusted his grip on the lead rope. "Mr. Peterson," James acknowledged with a civil nod, "brought your pet project to embarrass himself, I see." Peterson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Bold move, considering his history. "Ghost's past is behind him," James replied evenly, "as the past should be for all of us." Peterson's smile thinned. "We'll see about that. Bloodlines tell, Colonel. No amount of coddling changes what a creature is at its core." He turned away, leading his black stallion toward the preparation area. May the better horseman win. Sam exhaled slowly as Peterson moved out of earshot. That man could curdle milk with his pleasantries. "He's afraid," James said, watching Peterson's retreating back. "He knows what Ghost is capable of, what we're capable of together." The jumping competition was scheduled as the day's third event. As they waited their turn, James and Ghost remained at the edge of the grounds, far enough from the crowds to maintain the stallion's composure. Michael Crawford found them there, his face flushed with excitement. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere." Michael's enthusiasm faltered slightly as he glanced over his shoulder. "My father's watching for any sign of trouble. He's convinced your horse is a public danger." "And what do you think?" James asked, studying the young man's face. Michael straightened, meeting James's gaze directly. "I think Ghost deserves the chance to show everyone who he really is." A bell rang out across the fairgrounds, signaling the start of the jumping competition. James nodded to Michael before gathering Ghost's reins. "That's our cue." The show ring had been transformed for the event, with a series of jumps arranged in a pattern that would test both horse and rider. A panel of judges, including Judge Crawford, sat on a raised platform at one end, clipboards in hand and expressions impassive. The stands surrounding the ring were filled to capacity, the crowd buzzing with anticipation. Peterson and his black stallion, announced as Midnight Fury, were scheduled to compete immediately before James and Ghost. As Peterson guided his horse through the course, James studied their performance with a critical eye. The black stallion was clearly well-trained and powerful, clearing each jump with room to spare, yet James noted the tension in the animal's movements, the way it responded to Peterson's commands with mechanical precision rather than willing partnership. When they finished, the crowd erupted in appreciative applause. Peterson dismounted, patting the stallion with a smugness that suggested the competition was already decided. "Ghost and Colonel James Hartford," the announcer called, and a hush fell over the crowd. James mounted with the careful dignity that his injured leg demanded, settling into the saddle with the ease of decades of horsemanship. As they entered the ring, he leaned forward, speaking softly to Ghost. "Just like we practiced, nothing more, nothing less. Whatever happens, I'm proud of how far you've come." The stallion's ears flicked back at the sound of James's voice, then forward again, focusing on the course ahead. At the signal, they began. Ghost moved with a fluid grace that belied his size, approaching the first jump with measured strides. James guided him with minimal pressure, using his weight and gentle rein cues rather than force. Together, they cleared the obstacle with elegant precision. landing softly before gathering momentum for the next. Jump after jump disappeared beneath Ghost's hooves, each one negotiated with increasing confidence. The crowd, initially silent with tense anticipation, began to murmur in appreciation, then to applaud each successful clearance. By the time they approached the final and highest jump, a ripple of excitement had spread through the stands. Ghost gathered himself, muscles bunching as he prepared for the leap. In that suspended moment before takeoff, James felt a perfect harmony between them, two beings moving as one, unified in purpose and trust. Then they were airborne, soaring over the barrier with room to spare, landing with barely a sound on the other side. The crowd erupted. Even those who had come expecting failure or hoping for spectacle were moved by the performance they had witnessed. As James guided Ghost to the center of the ring, he caught sight of Michael Crawford standing at the rail, applauding wildly, and Sam beside him, beaming with undisguised pride. Peterson's expression was thunderous, his hands gripping the fence so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, Judge Crawford's face betrayed nothing, but the rapid movement of his pencil across his clipboard suggested the performance had not gone unnoticed. The results were announced an hour later, after all competitors had completed the course. Ghost and James had placed first, with Peterson's Midnight Fury taking second. The margin had been narrow but decisive. Ghost's clean execution and the evident partnership between horse and rider tipping the scales in their favor. As James accepted the blue ribbon, a murmur rippled through the crowd, growing into sustained applause. It wasn't just about winning, he realized. It was recognition, acknowledgement that what they had accomplished together represented something beyond a mere competition. The celebration was short-lived. As James led Ghost away from the award ceremony, Peterson intercepted them, his face flushed with barely contained rage. "This isn't over, Hartford," he hissed, keeping his voice low enough that only James could hear. "That horse is worth 10 times what he was before today, and I intend to claim what's mine. The law will side with me. Judge Crawford has already agreed to review the case." James met Peterson's gaze steadily. "Ghost earned his freedom today. Any man who tries to take it from him will answer to me." Peterson's lip curled in derision. Bold words from a crippled old soldier. "We'll see how much fight you have left when the sheriff comes for your precious horse." As Peterson stormed away, Sam approached, his expression concerned. "What was that about?" James shook his head, reaching up to stroke Ghost's neck. The stallion stood calm beside him, seemingly unfazed by Peterson's aggression. "Just Peterson being Peterson. Nothing to worry about today." But as they made their way back through the fairgrounds, the weight of Peterson's threat settled over James like a shadow. Ghost had proven himself beyond doubt, but in doing so, had only increased Peterson's determination to reclaim him. The battle they had won today was only the beginning of a larger war. The summons arrived 3 days after the fair, delivered by a nervous deputy who couldn't quite meet James's eyes. A hearing had been scheduled for the following Monday. Peterson had formally petitioned Judge Crawford to invalidate the auction sale and return Ghost to his original ownership. The document cited fraud, claiming the horse had been sold without proper authorization, and included affidavits from Peterson's men swearing they had been instructed to have the animal destroyed, not auctioned. "You'll come?" James asked Sam after sharing the news. They sat on the porch watching Ghost graze peacefully in the evening light. "Of course," Sam replied without hesitation, "and I've already spoken with the auction manager. He's prepared to testify that all proper procedures were followed." James nodded, grateful but not comforted. Peterson has Judge Crawford in his pocket. The facts may not matter. Then we'll appeal, take it to the circuit court if necessary. But they both knew such proceedings could take months, during which Ghost's fate would remain uncertain. The thought of the stallion being returned to Peterson's care, even temporarily, made James's stomach turn. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat by his bedroom window, watching the moon cast silver light across the fields. In the corral below, Ghost stood motionless, his white coat gleaming like a beacon in the darkness. The sight stirred something in James's memory, a half-forgotten story from his childhood about a mythical white horse that appeared to warriors on the eve of battle, offering freedom through surrender. "What would you choose?" James whispered to the night. "If you could truly choose." The answer came to him with the dawn, not in words, but in the certainty of a decision long deferred. As the first light broke across the eastern horizon, James saddled Ghost and mounted, his movements deliberate despite the early hour. There would be no rushing this final lesson. Together they rode beyond the boundaries of the farm, beyond the stream that marked the southern property line, into lands where James had not ventured since before the war. The morning mist parted before them as Ghost carried him with sure strides, responsive to the slightest pressure of James's knees, the gentlest touch of the reins. They crested a hill overlooking a valley where wild horses had roamed in James's youth. The herd was long gone, driven west by the encroachment of farms and towns, but the valley remained, a sweep of open grassland bordered by distant forests, untouched by fences or human claims. James dismounted carefully, his bad legs stiff from the ride. He removed Ghost's saddle and bridle, placing them on the ground beside him. The stallion watched him with curious eyes, ears pricked forward in silent question. "I've been thinking about freedom," James said, his voice soft in the morning stillness. "True freedom isn't given or taken, it's recognized." He placed his hand on Ghost's neck, feeling the strong pulse beneath the warm coat. "You've earned the right to choose your path, all of them, including those that lead away from me." Ghost remained still, his intelligent eyes fixed on James as if understanding every word. "I won't let Peterson cage you again," James continued, "even if it means letting you go." With that, he stepped back, creating space between them. Ghost hesitated, clearly confused by this departure from their routine. He took a tentative step toward James, then stopped, looking from the man to the open valley beyond. "It's all right," James assured him. "Whatever you choose." For what seemed an eternity, Ghost stood motionless, caught between the familiar comfort of human connection and the wild freedom of the valley. Then, with sudden decision, he turned and cantered several yards away, his stride lengthening with each step. James watched, his heart both breaking and swelling with pride as the stallion raced into the morning mist, a white ghost dissolving into the landscape. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it since the day he'd bought Ghost for those $5. Everything he'd done had been leading to this, not taming a wild spirit, but healing it enough that it could choose its own destiny. The ride back to the farm was long and solitary. James tried to find solace in knowing he had done the right thing, but the emptiness beside him felt like a physical ache. By the time he reached his property, the sun was high overhead, casting short shadows across the familiar landscape that suddenly seemed foreign without Ghost's presence. Sam was waiting at the fence, his expression shifting from concern to understanding as he saw James riding alone on his old mare. "You let him go." James nodded, dismounting stiffly. It was the only way to keep him from Peterson. "Judge Crawford won't be pleased to have his hearing rendered moot," Sam remarked. "He can bill me for wasting the court's time," James replied with a ghost of a smile. "Small price to pay." The following Monday, James attended the hearing alone, standing tall despite his aching leg as he informed the court that the horse in question was no longer in his possession. "And where exactly is this animal?" Judge Crawford demanded, his gaze cold. "Free, Your Honor," James answered simply. "As he was meant to be." Peterson's outrage filled the courtroom, but there was little he could do. Even Judge Crawford, biased though he might be, had to acknowledge that without the horse, the case had no practical purpose. The petition was dismissed, though not without a stern warning to James about the consequences of disposing of disputed property. James accepted the admonishment with quiet dignity and returned to his farm, to the empty corral and the silence that had replaced Ghost's gentle nickering. Life continued. Fields needed tending, fences required mending, and the rituals of farm work provided structure to days that might otherwise have collapsed into melancholy. 2 weeks passed, then 3. James had just finished his evening meal when a sound from outside caught his attention, the soft nicker of a horse, but not his old mare, who was secured in the barn for the night. Setting down his coffee cup, he moved to the porch, hardly daring to hope. There, at the edge of his property, gleaming in the fading light like a figure from a dream, stood Ghost. The stallion was thinner than when he'd left, with a new scar on his flank, but his eyes were bright and alert as they fixed on James. "Hello, old friend," James said softly, his voice steady despite the emotion welling in his chest. "You've been on quite a journey, I imagine." Ghost approached slowly, deliberately, stopping a few feet from the porch steps. For a long moment they regarded each other, man and horse, both marked by their pasts, both standing at the threshold of choice. Then Ghost closed the distance between them, lowering his proud head to rest against James's chest in a gesture of unmistakable decision. "Welcome home," James whispered, wrapping his arms around the stallion's neck. "Welcome home." In the months and years that followed, the story of the wild white stallion and the old soldier became something of a legend in the county. Ghost remained with James by choice, never again wearing a bridle but responding to voice commands with willing partnership. Together they worked the farm, rode the boundaries, and greeted each sunrise as companions who had found in each other what the world had tried to break in both: dignity, trust, and the courage to choose freedom even when it hurt. And if travelers passing the Hartford farm sometimes stopped to watch the magnificent white stallion running alongside a limping old soldier, well, that was just another small miracle in a world that needed reminding that the fiercest hearts are often the most gentle when handled with respect.